it's history now. I'm on very good terms with all my former colleagues in the government, and I'm moving on. And right now, I've just recently become a senior strategic advisor at McMillan, which is a major law firm. And so I will be working very hard to represent Canadian companies who are in China. And as you know, it's not the easiest time in China. So I will be doing that. I'll also be going back to my academic roots. Some 50 years ago, I was an undergraduate in Cambridge, England, and I'll be returning there as an academic visitor in early 2020. So I have these two activities that I am now focusing on.
I want to talk about what you're focused on and as well as get your take on the current situation, but I would love to get a read, because this is the first time we're talking to you since you left, on your take on your stint in diplomacy, because in many ways, you being in that role was supposed to elevate China and its relationship with Canada. And here we are right now where it looks like that's in a bit of a deteriorating position.
Well, I think that was the idea, and I think at the beginning it worked. I think we did well in China, but then along came these various troubles that we're having now involving Madam Meng, involving our two Canadian detainees. So things have obviously gone to a difficult situation. But I'm going on a different lane now. It's good that I'm talking to BNN first, because you're the business channel, and I'm mainly into business now. I'm on good terms with the government, but I'm on a separate lane now with Canadian businesses working in China.
But government relations is a key part of that. And I wonder, you say you're on good terms with the government and associates there. What was that phone call like with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau? When you characterize your relationship with him now as being on good terms?
Well, look, I think it was an unfortunate event. I think he does too, but I think we still get along very well. I've spoken to many of my former colleagues. Some of them have congratulated me for my new position. So I think we've moved on from there. And I think the stakes for Canadians in China are very high. There are many jobs at stake in many sectors where they depend very much on China, whether you're talking about canola farmers or pork farmers or the tourist sector or forestry companies or Canadian universities. There's much of Canada that depends very much on China. So important as the role of government is, it's critical. I used to be part of it. It's also important to be working on the other side with the Canadian businesses who are struggling now to sustain and grow their positions in China, on which the whole country depends a great deal.
Is that possible where it looks like relations are fractured? I mean, I look at a company like SNC-Lavalin, which had been doing business in Saudi Arabia, and then all of a sudden a diplomatic row between Canada and Saudi Arabia cost them business there. Is it possible for these businesses to advance their own initiatives in China at a time where the perception is that the relationship between our two countries is very fractured?
Well, many of these businesses are there for the long term. And this is a negative blip in the relationship. It may be a long blip, it may be a short blip, but they are there for the long term. And so what I always say to Canadian business people is don't just go to China often, because relationships are key. And it's even more important to go to China when the going is tough, because then you will show your commitment, and Chinese will remember that. So yes, the government has to resolve these issues. These are important issues. But I think businesses are still operating in China, and businesses can do the best they can to operate as best they can under the admittedly difficult circumstances of the day.
If you're a business executive that wants to do business in China or has business there, would you not be hesitant to go there now, considering that there are two Canadians being detained for no real apparent reason?
Well,
is it prudent to advise these business executives to be going to China
Well, they
at this
should
time?
always read the government advisory, which says to exercise caution. But my approach to them is to say that if you have a problem of any kind in the past with the Chinese government, don't go. But otherwise, if you are doing business in China and you want to maintain your relationship with your business partners and so on, it is a very good thing to go. And most of the business people I've spoken to have agreed with that.
Have you gone?
I'm going soon, and I will be meeting Canadian business people across the country and talking to them. partly to see if they want to have our services, but also to get a better idea of what is the state on the ground, how
and you're
bad
not
things
fearful
are.
of going back?
No, I'm not fearful. I'm not fearful at all. I am one of the few Canadians who have actually visited our 2 detainees in custody, and I've also spoken to their families. So I certainly hope very much that they will be released as soon as possible, and I hope very much that sooner rather than later, relations between Canada and China can return to normal. But this is not something I am directly involved in now. That is really for the government to work on.
But you have spoken to these detainees, as you mentioned, very few people have. How are they faring? How are they holding up? Because so little is known about their condition.
Well, their condition is not lavish, to put it mildly. They're under 24-hour surveillance. They only have access to consular service once per month. I have met them both. They're not happy with their situation, but I think they are coping as best as one can under the circumstances. I've also had conversations with their families, and I also know that certainly the government is seized of this. And I also know that from the point of view of Canadian businesses operating in China, we hope there is a resolution in all the aspects of the problems, and that life can return to normal sooner rather than later.
And as you are now going to China as a corporate ambassador for these Canadian businesses, how much easier would it be for you if there was, in fact, an ambassador in the role? I mean, nobody has fully taken up your role since you left. Amidst a laundry list of issues, whether it's these detainees, what's going on with the canola farmers, there doesn't seem to be one coherent diplomatic push.
Well, there is an acting ambassador, Jim Nicol, who is filling the role, and he's a very able person. At some point, I don't know when, the government will appoint a new ambassador, but in the meantime, I think the embassy is functioning fully and normally under the difficult circumstances.
But do you think Canada is doing all that it can and should be doing with respect to trying to repair the relationship with China?
I think they are. I think there's a limit to what they can do. Our Foreign Affairs Minister has sought conversations but hasn't got them yet with her counterpart. The Prime Minister has been talking about this issue frequently. So again, I am no longer involved in this, but obviously as a Canadian and as a person representing Canadian companies in China, I hope a resolution can be found as quickly as possible.
What do you think Canada should do about Huawei?
Well, that's not in my lane. That is a question
but it does
to be
factor
left to the
in,
government.
right?
It is an element, but that is not, that's way above my pay grade, and I'm not even in the public sector anymore. That's a question that the government has to determine.
As an observer, do you imagine that life could be easier for Canadian businesses wanting to do business in China if Huawei was granted access to our Canadian 5G technology?
Well, certainly that would please the Chinese, but Canada will decide on the basis of the security interests of Canada. I'm not a part of that decision, so we will have to wait to see what the government decides.
What are the questions and the actions that businesses need to be taking today in this environment that was perhaps different the first time that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau went to establish a relationship with the Chinese government, which by all accounts went very well. Yeah. And then we had the issues with Meng flare-up. And so now I have to imagine the businesses that you're advising have to make a different calculation. What are you going to be telling these businesses is a winning approach?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, engage with China. They're there for the long run. They're not going to come and go on short notice. They're there for the long run. And so they have to understand, they do understand that it's a difficult situation. But I think now is the time to do whatever they can to nurture their business partners, their customers, to try to convince the Chinese that now is the time to continue the relationships, not to impede them in various ways. And certainly now is the time to engage with China. I think the particular aspects of it will depend on which industry, but the general rule is to don't give up on China. I know they aren't, and continue to engage China and Chinese customers and Chinese clients as much as possible during this difficult period, because eventually this will be resolved, and each business wants to be in a good position at that moment, but also to do whatever it can during the difficult period to make things as good as they possibly can be for the immediate, but also for the longer term.
It's hard to see how businesses can make these meaningful inroads. I spoke with the VP of Richardson's, which of course is the big canola producer, and I asked them, well, how are your Chinese customers responding to this? And they're just as frustrated. They would love to be purchasing Canadian canola, but the government is getting in the way. So how productive is it to have these relationships with Chinese customers who may want to buy Canadian products if the cloud is that there's going to be government interference?
Well, I think that some of these Chinese business people talk to people close to government, and so the word gets around. If leading Chinese business people want to do more with Canada, want to not boycott Canada, want to loosen up with Canada, I think people in the government may hear that. But my role will be to talk to the business people, and indirectly they may influence their government.
Are Canadian businesses watching the outcome of the Canadian election and how that might change the tenor of relationships between Canada and China if Conservative leader Andrew Scheer comes out ahead? Or might this embolden Prime Minister Justin Trudeau ahead of the election to try and gain some wins when it comes to the issues going on with China?
Well, I think you're getting into the political domain,
which you still know something about.
A business channel. So look, I think that Andrew Scheer's position on China is, shall we say, harsher than the Prime Minister's. So there is a difference between the two, and I think that I'm not close to it anymore, but I think the Prime Minister will continue to do what he has been doing, which is to push for the release of our 2 detainees. Whether he'll succeed or not, I don't think we know at this time. But I do hope that one way or another, we will be able to find a way to bring things more back to normal.
So I hear you saying businesses need to be playing the long game, whether it's a short-term period of turmoil or longer, if you want to be there for 20, 35 years.
Well, there are other countries that have had these problems. South Korea was boycotted by China for a while over something to do with missile defense, and that lasted about a year, and then relationships resumed. Norway had a problem for a number of years over a Nobel laureate, which wasn't really their fault. Japan has had problems with China from time to time. All 3 of those countries now have normal relations with China. So I think these things have happened in other countries in the past. There's a difficult period, but then they get over it. And so I think our businesses are doing the best they can in the difficult period, but they are hoping as soon as possible we will get over it and return to normal. And I think the experience of those other countries suggests that these problems don't last forever.
How do Canadian businesses fare when it comes to the trade dispute going on between U.S. and China? Certainly, we're not the only ones that have to deal with China. When you look at all of these factors, how does this shake out for Canadian businesses?
Well, I think, first of all, speaking as an economist, I think trade wars are very bad, very dangerous for the whole world. I think the reason why the Great Depression of the 1930s was a depression and not a recession had to do with trade wars of the day. So I do think this is a dangerous trend, and I hope for the sake of Canadian business, but for the sake of the whole world, that the Chinese and the Americans can come to some agreement. Now, in the meantime, I think there could be pluses, there could be minuses. If there are major tariffs added to trade between China and the United States, that might open the door to more trade with other countries, possibly including Canada. So we'll have to see. But I think the broader question is the trade wars are bad, and even though there could be temporary advantages of certain kinds for Canada, if the Chinese and the Americans really go at each other, that's still not in the best interest of our country or of the world.